It had been 4 years since they had left Charnak. 3 of his sisters had been retrieved from their respective pits of suffering. One pit of suffering would require a second check, and the last was soon to come. 3 of his sisters had been retrieved from their respective. He understood now why each of his brothers fell to chaos, save Horus and Fulgrim. Magnus had likely been tricked by the innumerable dangers of the warp at some point, what with his rampant curiosity for all things immaterial, but that was pure speculation on his end. But as far as Guilliman knew, neither Horus or Fulgrim had clear reasons for their fall. That meant there was some factor in their lives he wasn't yet aware of, and that troubled his thoughts in idle moments. Many things troubled his thoughts in those times. Guilliman knew little of Barbarous, and that which he did know spelled out only poor conditions. It was the homeworld and domain of Mortarion during the Crusade, and his brother guarded the world jealously. He knew its coordinates, and that it orbited a dim yellow star. Its atmosphere was thick with a buoyant gas, toxic to humans, but which served to keep what little heat the star provided near the surface. The majority of the planet was frozen asides from these warm, lowland regions in which a resilient group of humanity eked out a meager life based on subsistence farming. Currently, the humans of the world were locked in a constant struggle with a group of xeno-sorcerers that dwelt in the high, toxic peaks. Those xenos were resistant both to the cold and the poison of the upper atmosphere, and as such were able to retreat to places that the human defenders simply couldn't reach. Mortarion had landed here, staying under the care of someone for some time. He did not know who sheltered him for his early life. He knew that at some point his brother Mortarion, with help from the Emperor, had managed to rally the humans of this world and eventually purge the xeno-sorcerers, after which the dim and densely atmosphered world became his primary recruiting planet. Actually, Guilliman wasn't sure that Mortarion consistently recruited from any other world at all. His recruitment was from Barbarous and any planets he happened upon when needing more Astartes. It was a very poor habit that almost all of his siblings shared, and one he was sure to emphasize the failings of to his sisters when it came time for that part of their education. No. It is best to recruit from stable recruitment centers on a large number of worlds that you set up during times of relative safety. That way, when times of constant warfare began, you had more than enough manpower to fight on as many fronts as you were required to. It was likely from Barbarous that Mortarion received most of his filthy habits, the prime example of which was that heavy collar he constantly wore. That collar expelled the gas synthesized in his modified armor, said gas not being useful emergency oxygen or even a nice lemon scent. Nothing pleasant like that. No, Mortarion let it synthesize noxious, toxic gas so he could constantly poison himself, so he could increase his resistance to toxins, so he could make it synthesize even more noxious gas and thus poison himself more, and so on and so forth. Really, in retrospect, it was no surprise at all that Mortarion, who poisoned himself constantly, fell under the sway of Nurgle, chaos god of poisoning yourself constantly. It was almost infuriating in how stereotypically that aligned. The cosmos needed to improve its writing. That development was cliché. No, Guilliman didn't know enough about Barbarous to feel confident in anything quite yet. The fact that the Emperor's sword ignited upon reaching this system as well did nothing to help his estimation for how things would go here. The world is choked with Nurgle's touch. Not to the point of becoming a daemon world, but far closer than is comfortable. The seer before him spoke. Sarnil's glare was firmly set on the distant pallid green dot, and Guilliman knew that his face had a similar expression.
"Sister is there?"
Petra grunted out a question as she stared at it. "So it seems," he replied. "Seer, can you locate my sibling?" Indeed, there's only one presence on the planet that could be them. They're in the northern half of the lowlands on the North continent. The seer raised and flexed a hand, causing the holographic display of the world to zoom in. Guilliman stared at it for a moment, noticing its presence within about 500 miles of the tallest mountain on the planet. That's where one of the Xeno-sorcerers would be, no doubt. Sarnu. I'll go with the detachment if you wouldn't mind. No need for ceremony here. I don't want to spend any time here if I don't have to. Sarnil nodded. I'll have the ships fan out and get active scans of the planet. This place crawls along my senses. I trusted none. Guilliman nodded in turn and moved to the doors, heading for the hangar. He stopped when he heard footsteps following him, pausing and turning his head. He saw the eyes of Petra glaring at him in her usual manner. "We're coming," she demanded. Likely they intended to aid him as warriors, considering what occurred on Kolkis. The thought was not without merit. They've had 1 to 3 years of practice each, under the tutelage of truly ancient Eldar warriors and himself, and learned the arts of war as fast as any primarch. They had wraithbone arms and armor fashioned for their personal use already, and would absolutely be a tremendous boon against nearly anything he could expect to find on a world such as this. He didn't need to consider his response for longer than a 2 heartbeat. Absolutely not. Turning and standing to his full height, he let his own eyes lock with hers, and Cassandra's and Aurelia's behind her. He let the frown on his face deepen. Why? She at least demanded an explanation, instead of simply insisting on coming with him. Then again, that was always Perturbo's manner, too dutiful to outright refuse an order, merely letting his resentment fester until it was too late. Petra was much the same in the end. He stared at the 3 for a moment longer before letting out a long and forgiving sigh and walking over to them, placing a massive hand on Petra's shoulder. He asked a question. "Do you know how old I am? Have I ever told any of you that?" "No," Cassandra answered bluntly. "I am over 500 years old. I have spent nearly all those years at war." There was definite surprise in their eyes and faces, but none of them were excitable enough to audibly react. Guilliman continued, "Please, trust me when I say that this is too dangerous for you. Not always. You all will be strong enough to break enemies like these by the hundreds eventually, but you're still growing now." He did not actually know what enemies would be present on this world, but he could certainly suspect, given the burning of the Emperor's sword in its sheath. He raised a hand to lift Petra's sullen ship up and smiled at her. "Your brother is strong enough to handle this, I promise. There will come a day in which I'll need help from all of you, an unfair amount of help in truth, but that will be when you're ready for it." He leaned down and touched his forehead with hers for a moment, before leaning back again. "I'd make for a poor brother if I asked my little sisters to fight my battles for me." Then, throwing herself forwards, her arms latched around his sides. She was quickly copied by Cassandra and Aurelia, who squeezed him as much as they could. He shook his head permissively and reached down to hug all 3 of them back. "Our new sister holds grudges. Let her prove herself too." Cassandra whispered seriously to him in the midst of the hug. His brow quirked, but he nodded all the same. Conrad had been tormented by visions. Cassandra had quickly learned to control them under the guidance of the Exodite seers. If she was offering advice, he was planning on trusting it. Let their new sister prove herself as well. The objective loaded itself into his mind and slotted neatly beneath. Make sure she lives and get her off the planet. It slotted right above exterminate all traces of chaos he found on this planet. "Please be safe," Aurelia muttered with a worried expression on her face. He reached up to rustle her hair, which she pretended to not enjoy. He stepped onto frosted, hard earth and into cold, wet air. His presence immediately met with thick, milky rolls of mist that attempted to spool around his legs. The hateful flame of his golden sword growled at this mist, keeping it far from reaching him, and melting the frost that clung to the ground as he passed. The trees were heavy with condensate and thickly covered in lichen, weighing them down tremendously and pulling some nearly to the earth. The rocks that littered the hard ground were covered in mosses of all varieties, and dew pooled in their shallow indentations. In the horizon far beyond and above, through a pale yellow-white atmosphere, he could see the peaks of bare and frozen peaks, from which clouds seemed not to clash against, but instead tumble down from, pouring into the valley that he had entered. None of this was as alarming as the sea of endless green vines and leaves, which covered the earth to his left for miles and strangled all things beneath their parasitic spread. He recognized it as a variety of arrowroot, a type of plant normally used as livestock feed on many agri-worlds, but a horrendously invasive pest left to its own devices, capable of consuming entire worlds of native vegetation if allowed to spread uncontested. This sample had been one of those, a pale green sea that allowed nothing else to live under its leaves. He ignored it for now. He had more important things to worry about. 10 eldar wielding fusion guns and wraithbone swords, ready for the rotten foulness typical of Nurgle's domain, stepped out of the webway gate, following behind him and automatically assuming defensive positions. He waited only long enough to make sure they had gotten through, before beginning a rapid gallop forwards, bounding over waterlogged rocks and burdened trees on his path forwards. Soon the trees gave way to the sight of a paltry village illuminated by smoke, choked watchfires, and a dim yellow sun. The blackened wood and damp straw of the buildings paired with the moss-infested stone walls and foundations to give the distinct impression of accumulating filth. The village was surrounded by recently renovated piled stones and stakes of wood, jammed into the hard ground and surrounding a perimeter around fields of recently harvested corn. A village that was currently being beset by a small legion of bloated, pale creatures of vaguely human shape, most of which were as tall as the average man, but 5 of which towered over the sodden buildings themselves and shambled forwards with open smiles and flickering tongues. He recognized the hallmarks of Nurglite sorcery at once. The stench was enough to tell him that. He also recognized a figure that was doubtlessly his sister, standing taller than any normal man but shorter than himself, tall and thin and clad in rough, stiff cloth. She wore a hood and thick cloth scarf over her face, a mantle which hung over a ragged tunic, tied around her waist with a length of twine and hung down into a heavy cloth skirt. A massive, crude farming scythe was clutched in both hands, and she swung in mighty arcs in front of her. Each swing cleaved another 1 or 3 of the shambling pale corpses down, a pace that none of the defenders that she led could match with their improvised plowshares beaten into swords and spears. Their line was holding, but doubtlessly there would be casualties if the fight was allowed to play out unhindered. Her left flank had more weary men and women, and less stakes to slow the onslaught. They would break through there, forcing them to fall back and sacrifice the leftmost houses to the attackers. Guilliman estimated 12 out of 100 casualties, considering his sister's situation. That was very good for a beginner. His corded legs bent, muscles bundled, and body leaned forwards. His gaze focused on a specific target, his feet adjusted accordingly. Speed was mostly a matter of strength relative to weight. You had to be strong enough to propel yourself forwards, but at a certain point, you also had to be heavy enough for gravity to force you to the earth in time for your next step. Jumping, on the other hand, only required an initial push. Cush. It was mostly a matter of strength. Guilliman was a primarch, strong enough to push aside tanks if he had something to brace himself upon. Guilliman leapt, and his titanic strength sent him flying in a calculated arc through the air as if he had been launched from a trebuchet. The angry tongues of flame upon his sword lashed the cold, misty air as he moved, scattering the fog with his presence. Right before he landed, he twisted his frame and swung his blade. The sword of the Emperor crashed into the curdled cream-like neck of one of the pale giants. The giant was split in twain, head burning to ashes in mere moments, as the 2 halves of its corpulent form went flying to either side of him, crashing into crowds of its lesser brethren and spreading golden flames about his landing site. His feet smashed into the mulch of the field, sending wet earth in a small wave from his point of impact. Hesitation was self-sabotage in the midst of a battle. Guilliman swung and stepped to the right as he rose from his forced crouch. The sword obliged with a wave of screaming fire that engulfed another row of pale corpses. The light from the flame was far brighter than the trickle of sunlight that made it through the dense clouds above. It made the battlefield far easier to see. A giant hand crashed down where he had just been, his step to the right causing him to narrowly avoid this attack. A half-twist let him turn into a wide, sweeping slash against the still-extended limb. The blubbery arm was cut off at the elbow, and the smile of the giant malformed thing of skin and fat fell as it staggered back, clutching at the now burning stump where its arm used to be. The smaller corpse attempted to bludgeon him. With great disdain for the relatively tiny thing, he backhanded it with his shield. The corpse went flying back, smashing into a small crowd of other corpses and knocking them over with it. He had landed in the middle of the corpse legion. Theoretically, he could fight his way to the front lines and defend them from there with waves of flame. Cassandra's warning advised against that otherwise correct option, and his plans adjusted accordingly. His sister and her rallied humans could defend against half the army without casualties. That much was well within their abilities from what he could evaluate. So instead, he and his escort would focus on purging the other half of the Legion of Dead. Swinging his sword again, he summoned a line of fire opposite of the direction he had summoned the first burst, effectively creating a wall of flame that prevented passage. The only open space was where he was currently standing. The corpses seemed to realize this. All 500 or so of them. They and their 3 shambling giants started to move in his direction with frowns on their bloated faces and arms ready to grasp and rip. He raised his shield and knocked the guard of his sword against it twice, a taunt. They charged, not noticing exodites with the eldar equivalent to melt the guns moving into positions behind them. It was nice to have simple opponents every now and then. Mounds of pale corpses burned with golden fire, slowly turning their brackish bodies into piles of pure gray ash. Dozens of these piles were strewn about the fields, and in the center stood a giant, not quite as tall as the bloated pale giants, but far more human in shape, if altogether too massive to be truly human. The giant in vibrant blue armor turned and revealed a skull-faced helm to the defenders of Wreath Village and the Harvest Princess that had been leading their defense. The shield of the giant bore a great and healthy bird of prey, the kind that devoured lesser birds, and his sword burned with a fearsome, shining light. With his shield arm, the giant reached up and lifted the helmet off of his head. A head of wheat gold hair, shining blue eyes, and strong, handsome, unscarred features, a kind of masculine beauty that could not be found in the people of Barbarous, only dreamed of among wild and unrealistic fantasies. The giant sheathed his burning blade and strode forwards amongst a pond of ash. Soot clung to his legs and stained them ashen gray. With distrustful eyes, the Harvest Princess moved forwards to meet the stranger and keep him well away from her chosen people. Eventually, before reaching within weapons reach of either party, they stopped. Feeling briefly ashamed of her own appearance, the Harvest Princess reached up to pull off her own hood and pull down his scarf, revealing the face beneath. A shock of bone-gray hair tumbled down from a thin face, flesh sucked tight around high cheekbones and fair features. Lips were dry and cracked from endless torrents of cold winds, and hawkish amber eyes stared out from tired sockets. She let her scythe rest against her shoulder and glared at the unfairly handsome stranger. "Who are you?" It was a demand. The stranger obliged with words she trusted little. "I am Malum Kaido, your older brother." The stranger's gaze was calm and understanding, focused and sharp and well-rested. "Necair didn't tell me of a brother," she joylessly ground out. If he was older than her, then he must have been serving that creature for longer. "I am the son of the Emperor of Mankind." Not whoever raised you. You were sent to this planet at birth by the spell of the enemy." She paused at that before narrowing her eyes. "Why are you here?" The stranger nodded patiently. "In truth, I was looking to find you, to bring you home." She tensed aggressively at those words. She wasn't going to leave until she had the bastard's head. "But I see that you have a duty here. If so, I'd like to help you with that first. And if I don't want to go with you," she growled out, voice thick with suspicion. He nodded. "So long as this planet is made safe for you, you may choose to stay if you wish. It's my own duty to ensure your safety after all." She stared at him for a long moment, searching for deception. She found none, only honesty upon an unblemished face. Slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. He smiled gently at her. "My ship has rations for these people, rations and warm, dry flooring. Would you like me to provide such as we talk further?" She swallowed nervously, hand gripping her scythe tightly. "What's your name, sister?" "Morrigan. Morrigan." The planet Barbarous had 3 primary continents, 2 of which sat upon the north and south poles, and 1 massive landmass that sat between them, closer to the northernmost continent than the southernmost. The continents at the poles were permanently frozen and had no signs of life or psychic presence that could be detected. It was this middle northern supercontinent that their attention was focused upon, split into 3 primary sections by a massive Y-shaped mountain range in its near center, and the variety of smaller mountains along and near the coastlines that served to help trap precious heat in the valley regions. The majority of this continent was various pallid shades of white and light green, with the occasional spot of vibrant, poisonous green. These spots were semi-frequent, but the fact that he could see them from orbit, even if they were tiny, meant their true size was enormous. Patches of that arrowroot he witnessed earlier, no doubt. Unsurprisingly, there were 7 Nerdle sorcerers, from what the ships had been able to detect, each one residing on one of the 7 highest mountains on the continent, with the overall lord residing on the absolute highest peak. What was more surprising was how many villages and settlements there were. On a continent this large, even accounting for the poor conditions, he would expect tens of thousands of settlements, each with anywhere from 100 to 100,000 inhabitants, depending on a wide range of variables. There were not that many, however. There were a bit less than 600 currently inhabited settlements from what the seers had been able to sense. Of those settlements, exactly 1 of which had a population approaching 1,000, and only a small percentage had a population over 100. Guilliman couldn't see the planetary population as being higher than perhaps 50,000, not with the figures he had been provided. Morrigan and the village elder, a withered-looking man of 34 named Thomas, had shocked looks on their faces when they heard the expected number of people on the planet, but for entirely separate reasons that Guilliman and Asarnil did. A quick exchange of glances between the 2 of them led to a silent agreement to not startle them further. For now. "You said that you were forced to leave your first planned base of operations, correct?" Guilliman asked, bringing the 2 feral worlders back to focus on the task at hand. "It was another village that was overrun by dead." "Not dead, my lord." The village elder shook his head, pock-scarred brows furrowed. "Strange weed. It grew too fast for us to keep pushing back, and killed one of the dogs in the night. We packed up and left on the good lady's advice, heading for Wrath. Of course, just as we showed up did we learn that the Pale had been seen marching towards it." Guilliman raised a brow. "Strangleweed? Are you referring to that bright green vine that spreads rapidly? If it managed to kill a dog in the night, yes, my lord." "How fast does it grow here? Have you measured that?" "Yeah." Tomas trailed off as he tried to think, eventually raising his deeply calloused hand. "About 7 hand lengths between each day, my lord." I don't know for certain, though. I'm sorry, my lord. Guilliman leaned back, crossing his arms in thought, before coming to a conclusion. That's about thrice as quick as it should be. It's almost certainly warp-fueled. Does it matter? Morrigan growled out beneath her stiff cloth mask, glaring at the quickly sketched map of the world on the table in front of them. It might, but I have little evidence of such at the moment. Only a feeling. Guilliman shook his head and let the information sit in the back of his mind for the moment, focusing on the problem at hand. 7 is an important number to Nerdlight sorcerers. It's likely that they're drawing power from it. Our focus should be in killing them quickly, to diminish their numbers and surround their towers. The shortest peaks will be the easiest to reach, and the highest will have the greatest concentration of the toxins. Morrigan grunted in agreement, but added a statement alongside a hooded glare. A flash of memory pain flared up in his largest scar. He ignored it easily enough. Necrons is mine to kill. Guilliman raised a brow. The one who took you in, correct? He is one of the sorcerers? He is the Pale King. She ground out challengingly, daring him to make a criticism. Guilliman took in the information, sorted it away, and adjusted his parameters. He dwells in the highest tower then, I assume. We shall attack him last then, to ensure he is at his weakest and without allies. The fact that she was apparently also raised by Nerdlight Xeno-sorcerers was something of a concern and explained entirely too much, but she had clearly already broken free from its yoke and was now attempting to bring the sorceress overlords down. If it was a problem, it wouldn't be after they were killed and the planet purged of Nerdlight influence. It wasn't worth immediate concern at the moment. It was something he would try to speak with her about after the present danger was over, though. He wasn't sure if he could actually get through to her, but simply ensuring the planet wasn't covered in rotten warp smog far earlier than it had been before would be the best he could do. She blinked, staring at him for a moment, before nodding sharply and turning her attention back towards the map. You'll need a new center of power to build from regardless. Asarnil began, bringing a finger across the map for a moment before tapping the largest settlement on the map, a larger village named Torchwood that was in the upper right basin of the continent. Then his finger began to tap the other villages on the map. We should be able to gather up the villages from across the continent and bring them here. The harvest had just been gathered, so there should be enough food for at least one season. If we act fast enough, the combined manpower from all the settlements should be enough to lay the foundations of a proper city and defensive stronghold. Much of the essential buildings and walls can be created by the handful of Bonezingers. It would provide a defensible. Guilliman trailed off as he looked upon the face of the increasingly worried Tomas. Yes, Elder. Saying that to a man in his 30s was distinctly amusing, but now wasn't the time for humor. Getting that many in one place, that's just asking for a nasty pox to come. Claim us all, me lords. I don't claim to know any of this fancy war business, but it's old wisdom that you don't want more than 100 in one place, and 1,000 is just madness. Thomas wrung his hands, and his eyes darted about as he spoke, unwilling to look at them directly. Another thing on the list then, setting up apothecaries and teaching your people proper sanitation. Guilliman replied, turning to the map again. Still, the idea wasn't without merit. They would struggle with such for a while, especially in a world so shrouded by Nurgle's influence. Then if not one capital, a series of villages surrounding a central fortress, torchlight in the center. Then each half day of walking away, another village can be erected and fortified. That will force us to slow our pace somewhat, but will help negate potential illnesses. 2 rings of such townships should be enough to house everyone on Barbarous. Each township would require another day of constant work, assuming we do things properly. Asarnil roughly estimated, comparing his labor force to what he knew of Guilliman's architectural preferences. From here, Guilliman and Asarnil began a rapid back and forth of war planning in Gothic to make sure the other 2 could understand them. Channels will have to be dug and new fields tilled, but we should have a human workforce enough for that. Can one of your singers be dedicated to producing tools instead? Shovels and scythes, primarily. It would slow the rest of the work, but not disastrously so. In the meantime, you and your sister should be focused on bringing down the lesser sorcerers. The Wraiths will care little about the toxins. The armor of my warriors is well insulated, which leaves only a suit for your sibling. We should have the supplies to make such. The webway will allow us to attack all of them in a day if we manage to avoid injuries against each previous one. It may be prudent to see if the weapons on the ships can destroy any of their towers first, saving the effort of needing to perform potentially costly ground assaults. They may have tunnels to hide within, and basic divination would tell them to hide there quickly. A ground assault would be required to make sure they don't escape their tower's destruction. They do. A voice interrupted them. The Primarch. An Eldar blinked, turning their gazes towards the serious-looking Morrigan and the utterly baffled-looking Tomas. They have underground sections? Guilliman asked for clarification. Morrigan nodded. Necrons did, at least. It's where the Pale are kept when not being sent out. In the corpse silos. Corpse silos, Guilliman muttered. Do you recall how many were in Necrons' corpse silo? I never counted past 1,000, but perhaps about 10 times more than that. Her dry voice echoed grimly. An army of 10,000 corpses like that, assuming 1,000 of them were giants like before, that was still nothing that prepared defenses couldn't deal with. They were large, decently strong, and clumsy. Not a particular threat except through the weight of bodies. And that was something proper fortifications would funnel and destroy even with a fraction of their numbers and defenders. Still, 10,000 was quite the stockpile of dead flesh. Assuming each of the 7 sorcerers had similarly sized battle groups of the dead, that would be 70,000 in all. Significantly more troublesome to deal with using static defenses. But the webway gate generator on board each of the Eldar ships provided more than enough raw mobility to simply circle about such a force and attack with impunity. It would take quite some time to whittle down, but a force of that many unintelligent bodies without weapons simply wasn't a threat against half-decent tactics. Asarnil sipped his wine, nodding slightly, and likely coming to a similar conclusion as Guilliman. A potential threat on the open field, but nothing that proper ranged weaponry and prepared defenses couldn't deal with. They had more than enough ranged weapons, and more than enough mobility to simply kite such a force to death. Guilliman could likely do the same even without a proper ranged weapon. Note to self, he needed a proper ranged weapon. Something one-handed, he could wield it while having the shield strapped to his arm. Some variation of bolter would be ideal, but perhaps one of the shorter Eldar guns. Most of them were entirely too long, making them awkward to use in close-quarters combat, a consistent problem he had noted in their designs. Thomas passed out, eyes rolling into the back of his head, forcing a nearby maid to catch him before his head smashed against the corner of the table. Would you like to meet your sisters? Guilliman asked aloud, breaking the silence that descended upon him and Morrigan. They were on a balcony inside Charnak's Pride, overlooking the hangar bay in which the entirety of the 2 villages were currently contained and being treated by Eldar professionals. Clothes were taken and cleaned of the thick layers of grime, sheets provided in the interim. Food was rationed out, met with disbelief, and murmured prayers of thanks. Injuries treated and people washed in cleaned water. Sicknesses treated, and medicine provided, all of which were supported by Eldar biomancy and blessings, just in case. Just in case. Roughly 300 people in total, 2/3 of which were incapable of fighting, were in the far corner of the hangar bay. More than enough room allocated to them to be rather spacious should they choose to be. And even then they barely took up a fraction of the 5-kilometer-long ship's interior. Their supplies, as ratty and gnarled as they were, took up less space than an Eldar fighter craft. Boxes of pale corn, sheets of moth-eaten quilts, tools of rusted iron and battered bronze. They made a distinct and unfortunate comparison to the elegant lines and pristine craftsbuildership of their current benefactors. Those 300 people looked healthier and cleaner than they probably ever have before. And quite a few of them were enthralled with the act of touching their flesh where pox scars used to be, and staring at the faces of their loved ones, now free of muck and blemish. Guilliman felt pity for them, and what labors they were going to have to go back to soon. Sisters? Morrigan muttered, leaning over the balcony and staring at him from the corner of her vision. She clutched at her worn scythe with a grip that tensed and untensed periodically. Petra, Cassandra, and Aurelia. Guilliman explained, "We'll be attacking the first tower as soon as it's daylight again, so you have a few hours before it begins. Your armor will be done by then, and a weapon can be too if you wish for it. There's not much to do now that the initial planning is finished, so you're free to do as you wish. Well, I suppose you don't have to meet them if you don't want to. I'll simply say that you're busy if you wish." "No," Morrigan denied before turning to glare at him more completely. "Why are you doing all this? Bringing a massive fleet of sorcerers from the depths of the void just to help me? Putting in all this effort and resources into trying to fix my problem. What are you getting out of this?" she demanded, jabbing the top of her scythe into his ribs with a suspicious growl. Guilliman stared at her for a moment, brows raised in slight surprise. His expression smoothed out into a calm understanding quickly enough before he nodded and began to explain. "The fleet wasn't just to help you. There were many tasks I needed to handle throughout the galaxy to prepare for what's to come. It just so happened that helping you was one of those many things I had to do." Morrigan slowly retracted her scythe, eyes still glaring. Guilliman continued. "And in truth, the use of the webway, the creation of wraithbone structures, and providing supplies and aid costs me little. We had prepared for 10 years of voyage, double our predicted travel time. Home is only about a year away from here, so providing spare supplies like this doesn't provide much risk of running out. Wraithbone is psychery I barely understand, but it's essentially just a matter of time and effort, both of which we have a surplus of at the moment." Morrigan planted her scythe on the floor and leaned forwards on it, a lone eye still looking at him. He kept speaking. "These sorcerers are worshippers of Nurgle, as near as my allied seers can determine. Nurgle is a daemon of rot and sickness, and destroying his followers is something that I was intending on doing in great amounts regardless, so this task isn't something that anyone here dreads. It's something we all look forward to, in truth." Morrigan's eyes trailed down, no longer staring at him, so he finished his thoughts. "But even disregarding all of that, I care about you." She tensed, eyes jolting up to stare at him through ashen locks. He met her gaze directly, a gentle smile on his face. "You're my sister, Morrigan. I'd be a rather poor example of a brother if I decided against aiding simply because it was inconvenient to me. I want you to be safe and happy, and as this is something you've decided to do, I wish to help you do it." He reached up to scratch his cheek. "Of course, if what you wanted to do was evil, such as killing a large number of puppies or something, I'd like to have a strongly worded conversation with you first. But this is just about the furthest thing from evil as you can get. That's about as righteous as it comes. I'm proud of you already, and I've barely known you for a day." He let his gaze turn away, down towards the villagers of Barbarous as they marveled at how warm and dry the hangar bay was, and how their children didn't have to huddle about campfires burning damp wood for warmth and choke of the immense smoke that billowed from such. How they didn't have to suffer from cold and dark and fear. How they were safe, fed, and clean. Luxuries they probably never got to have on Barbarous. After a long few minutes of silence, broken only by the distant noise of awestruck feral worlders, "Take me to my sisters." Morrigan muttered, "I want to talk to them." Guilliman smiled and pushed off the railing. Starting to walk out of the hangar bay, followed by Morrigan, he began to speak. "It would be my pleasure. I have to warn you, though, they have their quirks." Quirks? Petra is very grumpy and tries to hide how much she cares behind criticism. Don't let that get to you, though. She's a very sweet girl underneath, and she likes to hug. Cassandra is quiet and stares a lot, but she's normally daydreaming, not trying to be offensive. Aurelia loves to learn, so if you let her badger you into answering questions about Barbarous, you'll be there all day. Very excitable like that, but be careful, Abel. And off they went, Guilliman bragging about his little sisters the entire way.